So apparently speedrunning's the thing, so here we go. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Where I take space related stories from around the internet and read them out for your enjoyment. All the relevant links are down below, and please don't forget to do the usual YouTube gump, because if you don't, the nanoswarms will steal your other sock. But more importantly, as always, I hope that you enjoy. Blammo! Personal best. I just want to give a quick thanks to the Tier 5 channel members and patrons. Bob the Dragon, Datamagnet, Sergeant Puma, Cat Crab Lobster, and Duck Machine. Thank you very much for the support. It is much appreciated. The Peace Table, written by IAreGoodAtRighting. The war with the Terran Confederation was lost. Once the latest reports from the frontier reached the core systems, support for the war fizzled out almost immediately. Nobles demanded peace, worried about their border holdings. Burghers argued in their guilds, enraged about how the war was disrupting trade. The clergy preached to the masses on every planet, claiming the war went against the will of the Ancient Ones. King Mezec the Daring glared at his courtiers in the throne room, fist clenched against the arms of his chair. Lonely servants and powerful vassals openly wept at the nation's defeat, each one trying to outperform the last. Occasionally, someone who was in especially low standing with the king would fall to the floor in grief, squinting at Mezec to see if he noticed their show. He hated court life or the passion, much preferring the battlefield where your allies and enemies are clear. Half of the despondent court would later celebrate how the war undermined his authority. But the military life of his youth was over, now that he had the weight of the kingdom of his shoulders. The double doors at the end of the hall swung open, revealing a page flanked by several royal guards. The boy shouted something that was lost in the crowd of sobbing courtiers. "Shut up, all of you!" Mezec shouted, and slammed his fist against the throne. The uproar of crying cut off instantly. The only trace that it ever happened were the echoes that reverberated off the high, vaulted ceilings. The king waved a hand towards the page. With a grateful nod, the boy spoke. "The Terran delegate is almost here, Your Majesty," he repeated in a quieter voice. "Make your proper arrangements," Mezec said. The page and his entourage bowed and backed out of the room, disappearing when the doors closed again. The king slumped back into his throne and lost himself in thought. It was concerning how little he knew about the Terran Confederation. They were a young nation, far from the center of the galaxy. Until now, the Terrans were largely ignored by the bigger players on the galactic stage. He didn't even know what they looked like, and doubted anyone in the kingdom knew as well. Most interspecies interactions took place with as little contact as possible. Automated ships for trade and that sort of thing. Even in war, battles were fought in space between navies, not on planet surfaces. Neither side wanted to fight over a planet just to turn it into a smoking ruin. It wasn't because of vastly different biologies that were surprisingly similar amongst the races. The reason for isolation was because the psychologies of each species was so vastly different. Anything more than a basic interaction would result in a war that wouldn't end until one side was driven to extinction. So, when the Terrans insisted on meeting face to face instead of the usual written missive, it made him uneasy. Realizing the entire court was watching him in silence woke Mezec from his contemplation. Their faces were stone masks now, but the king could feel the fear in the air. He wasn't the only one thinking about the consequences of this meeting. It was too late to back out now. Not like he was in a position to refuse the meeting. He leaned to his steward, standing beside the throne. "Get rid of the non-essentials," he whispered. The steward nodded and pounded his staff against the marble floor 3 times. Servants, knights, and lesser nobles scurried out, leaving only the most important members from each estate and a small army of heavily armed royal guards lining the walls. The burghers were the first to sit in a long peace table at the foot of the throne, followed by the clergy in their long flowing robes. Finally, the nobles moved to take their own places. Even before everyone had been seated, they began muttering to each other. probably discussing the fastest way out of the room if negotiations turned into a bloodbath. Maklavic rubbed his fingers across his brow and sighed. He could only hope that these Terrans didn't know how bad things really were. Compared to most slugfests between superpowers and the Galactic Center, this war was closer to a skirmish. But it was one that was embarrassingly one-sided in the favor of Terrans. Maklavic wanted to commit more forces to the frontier, but didn't want to expose the core systems to attack from neighbors more powerful and malicious than some backwater nations. After spending a few minutes of meaningless speculation and nervous mumbling past, the page opened the door again. Dozens of the most influential people in the kingdom watched him. May I present the Terran delegation? The page didn't bother concealing the terror in his face. It did a half bow and sprinted away. Members of the estates held their breaths and waited, only staying in their seats from fear over invoking the king's ire. Royal guards gripped their plasma rifles closer to their chests and eyeballed the entrance. Maklavic leaned forward on his throne, eager to see what kind of people defeated his mighty kingdom. Clearly, they must have evolved for war, he reasoned. Long, mysterious shadows danced across the wall in the outer hallway as the Terrans closed in. They turned the corner and came into full view. The king's suspicions were confirmed when he saw the beasts that marched into the throne room. 5 reptiles dressed in traditional ceremonial armor stepped forward, having to duck to fit through the entrance. Their jaws alone were as big as Maklavic's head, and filled with rows of dagger-like teeth. A few burghers rose out of their chairs to run, when suddenly the Terrans all dropped to one knee and spoke in unison. "King Maklavic the Daring, we are honored to be in your presence," they said in gravelly voices. Maklavic physically reared back in shock. The members of the estate gaped at the Terrans. The royal guards tilted their heads and looked at each other, unsure what to do. These delegates of a foreign nation had just properly greeted the king according to tradition. Holding the pose, the Terrans waited for Maklavic to speak. The king scratched his head, trying to gather his senses. "Arise, delegates from the Terran Confederation, and join me in this peace talk." He stared at the 5 reptiles, and then at the dozens of empty seats at the other end of the table. "I was expecting more of you." As if command, more shadows appeared in the hall outside of the throne room. 5 bird-like creatures waddled into the room. The tallest amongst them only reached Maklavic's waist. Each of them had 2 eyes on top of their heads and 2 below. "What is the meaning of this?" A noble stood up and said to everyone and no one. Ignoring the comment, the new envoys kneeled and repeated the ancient phrase. For a full minute they held the pose as Maklavic tried unsuccessfully to piece the situation together. Eventually, he spoke. "I don't know who you are, but I'm afraid that we're only meeting with the Terran Confederation." He gestured towards the reptiles taking their seats at the table. The avian newcomers glanced at each other and then at the king. "We are the Terran Confederation," the one in the middle spoke. Maklavic scowled at the aliens in the throne room. These so-called Terrans were taking him for a fool. Both species couldn't be Terrans, yet each one claimed to be a part of the delegation. It was more concerning that 2 completely different species were actually tolerating each other. That didn't happen. Whoever these people were, they were up to something. For a brief moment, he considered seizing these schemers and throwing them into the dungeon. He immediately quashed that idea after thinking back to the pitiful reports from the frontier. For now, he had no choice but to play this little game with the Terrans. "Very well," the king said. "Join the table then." A race of crustaceans entered next, more racers coming in after them. Maklavic's grip on the arms of the throne grew tighter each time a new species came in and repeated the damned phrase. Then he realized what was happening. Judging by the bewildered and panicked looks of each member of the estates, they hadn't figured it out. Beneath all the niceties and bowing and congeniality, this was a threat, a display of power. The Terran ambassadors weren't armed. but he felt like a cornered animal all the same. The king scanned the far end of the table, going from race to race. Predatory species sat with prey, mammals, reptiles, insectoids, and more, calmly discussing the details of their treaty like they weren't from completely different worlds. No wonder why his kingdom was so soundly defeated, MacLeod thought. Somehow the real Terrans brought these races together, settled their differences, and united them under one banner. It took all of his restraint to not tear the arms of the chair off in rage. Similar revelations hit the nobles, burghers, and clergymen on his side of the table, based on their grim expressions. The Terran side of the table was nearly full. The king mused that there was never a point in history where so many races sat in one room together without getting each other. He allowed himself a grim smile. Just when he was about to officially start the negotiations, one more species entered the throne room. A group of two-legged mammals walked in, elegant clothing covered in smooth skins. "And you must be the true Terrans." MacLeod watched as the new creatures as they filled the remaining gap at the peace table. "With all due respect, King MacLeod," the leader raised its arms and motioned towards the rest of the aliens at the table. "We are all true Terrans." It clapped its hands together and grinned. "Now, shall we begin?" End of story. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you do, please consider supporting the author, even by popping over and leaving a thumbs up or a nice comment, just to show your appreciation for the story. However, if you wish to support this channel, there are links down below which will help immensely. I will see you all in the next one, and until then, I hope that you have a fantastic day. Cheers.